seems as though a lot of mythology surrounding time and space has a lot to do with the confining aspects. I want to sort of disassemble and break down what I see to be a very limiting paradigm when it comes to time and space. Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I thought we might have a nice chat about spirituality and science, or more specifically where they intersect, which is a point of convergence or a gray area that I tend to find is much larger than either of the extremes, spirituality and science being on either end. This specifically is going to pertain to the topics of time and space as I see them and use them in my spiritual practice, so I hope this can be helpful for anybody out there who is interested in working with those concepts, whether they be personified, abstract, and I'm going to get into the specifics of that in just a bit. But I do want to show the tokens that I've been working with specifically in my spiritual practice to symbolize and get a more visual representation of these, I'm going to call them concepts. This is just a compass that's in the shape of a wheel for a boat, so it's kind of nautical. This was found at a flea market. It is a functional compass, so I am able to see and use it to orient myself. And then there's this pocket watch, which was given to me by a friend. Right now it's not in working order, but I just need to replace the battery, but it's more symbolic than anything, so that's really what I've been using it for. I put these out on my altar and view them in a very similar light that I do my more elemental tokens, things like an athame to symbolize air, a wand for fire, a chalice for water, yeah, I said that right, and a pentacle for earth, as we see in some more traditional, I would say more Wiccan or Alexandrian type traditions where we have the four elements represented in a sacred space or on an altar. I've chosen to implement time and space as key players and elemental, I guess, dignities on my altar and to work with them in that fashion. For me, I think the concepts of time and space are very interesting as dimensions. Of course, we function within the third dimension. We have objects that have depth and width and space. I'm by no means a physicist or a scientist. I'm not a mathematician, just a curious human being, so I have no authority or schooling, any sort of certification on this. This is really just my ramblings and musings on this topic. But I do think that time and space are abundantly interesting as they pertain to spirituality and magic, along with just our daily lives, things that we tend to take for granted. And of course, we know very little about, I would argue. Of course, it seems that we know or think we know a lot more about space, but time is really one of those big question marks as to the perception of time, how to measure it, what it actually is, the sort of intangibility of time. And so I prefer to view them as elements and concepts that makes them easier for me to work with in a more mental, heady sort of way. I tend to think that when we take a concept or an element and we personify it, that's when we get something that I would liken to a deity. We think of things like fire, and when we personify fire, of course there are many gods and goddesses and mythologies that have to do with fire and those who rule over fire in its various aspects, anything from a goddess like Hestia, who presides over the hearth and home, so that's more warm and welcoming, versus you might have somebody like Helios or Belanos, who would be more of this masculine outward outpouring of light and fire. There's the whole spectrum, and really I think that's when we start to get more specific. That's just my take as somebody who tends to see the overlap between a lot of deities, gods, goddesses, and higher powers, and tend to think of them as just greater forces. For me, it becomes a bit limiting when I try to assign a name and a face and a visage to what that thing might be. I think it transcends that. That's my personal opinion. So when I work with time and space, I tend to view them in this very broad, vast, incomprehensible way, and while that can sometimes feel overwhelming, I do find that easier to grapple with than the sort of finite way I might work with something super specific. So, for example, with time and space, those are a little bit more, you could argue astrologically speaking, Saturnian types of elements, things that might apply to Saturn or Kronos, that sort of fatherly limiting figure. And when we get into astrology, it tends to be that very structured and ordered way that we approach life, with restriction and challenge. And it seems as though a lot of mythology surrounding time and space has a lot to do with the confining aspects. I want to sort of disassemble and break down what I see to be a very limiting paradigm when it comes to time and space. And I think that's what I'm trying to do in making this video, speaking to time and space as they pertain to spirituality, and also working with them in my own spiritual practice. I think as human beings, we like the idea of there being boundaries as much as we might rail against them and try to find ourselves outside of them. To some degree, boundaries are safe. They can create a sort of system to work within. It's something that's knowable. It's not as overwhelming. It's not as frustrating. It's not as formless. And I think we like to work within systems. We like patterns. As human beings, we look for patterns and repetition and form to make sense of our reality, to decide upon a consensus reality, and that gives us something to work on in terms of creating a community that can agree upon things. So I guess taking the idea of time and space as limiting concepts, assigning them to something that's more like the idea of what we see with Saturn, and using our lives to sort of try to transcend or try to work within the context of this confining aspect is something that we can get along with quite well. Challenges, or for example, if we take the idea of a narrative, which arguably all of our lives are in a very complex way, if there aren't challenges, what's the narrative even about? And so an inherent challenge in life would be the idea of time and space, and working within those sort of confines or rules, if you will, the rules that we sort of foist upon ourselves. Of course, we have the way that we measure space, which is, I guess, a little bit more agreed upon and harder to refute. We do function within a physical body that we perceive in 3 dimensions, and we contend with our physical reality, which confronts us in many ways and is hard for us to fully deny, I would say. And time, we've even found a lot of ways, of course, to integrate into our space. I think time and space are, in my opinion, hard to separate. They're a bit inextricable in that way, but we have sort of created a more physical construct or way that we choose to work with time, something that I think we really don't understand much at all. And as I use it in my spiritual practice, I tend to think of me as a being and my life to function within the realms of time and space, but not to be limited by them, that I interact with and have a sort of interplay with those elements in the same way that I would with fire, water, earth, and air in their more metaphorical or figurative roles, as we imagine, fire to be more of a vitality, water to be more intuitive and deep and sub or unconscious, air to be, of course, intellectual and sharp and light. Things like that. I tend to look at time and space as being very fluid and able to be manipulated. So if we're thinking in terms of spellcraft or perception, I think a lot of what for me comes out of my spellcraft, or that I approach spellcraft, the mindset I approach spellcraft in, is that my perception is going to be the ultimate sort of, I would say, outcome. The way that my perception either shifts, or the way that I can shift my perception to change my reality, is going to be the primary outcome of any sort of magical working. And that is going to entail time and space, of course. Of course, we tend to view things in a linear fashion. There's the big case that's been said for many years, time is not linear, sort of trying to investigate the various avenues and string theory and just the way that one might perceive and work through and work with time. But on a daily basis, we measure time through light, we measure it through clocks that we've created to move us through in a linear fashion. So we sort of keep ourselves to that, and you might say that that's a collective perception that binds us. It's a glue that holds us all together for the sake of community, but it's also reinforced, so it's hard for one person to entirely escape it when the collective is so powerful, I would argue. So our unique autonomy, our independence is not necessarily enough to fully individuate itself from those large, big, grand scale societal concepts. However, we can, I think, tweak and work with or work within those imposed concepts that we perpetuate, of course, over time, that slowly shift. When we're speaking on a societal level, those perceptions are not going to change overnight. The size and scale of them lends itself to something that needs to change incrementally. And when it does change quite quickly, that's when we get really jarring effects in society, which we've seen in various other areas. But I tend to like to think of what I'm doing to function within time and space and to try to manipulate it to some degree to my favor. I, of course, can change my space that I'm within. I'm constantly moving through time and within time. And to me, I find that to be empowering rather than being the subject or at the whim of these external forces. I am very much a co-creator. I am in sort of cahoots with these forces, and the more that I envision it as a partnership, a friendship, an alliance, the more autonomous I feel, the more I feel I have agency over my body, my existence, my choices, and by virtue of that, the things that come out of my experience. And so when I approach spellcraft and I do assign, I guess to some degree, more or less, more concrete faces to time and space, when I speak to them as if they are sentient, I feel as though I'm having a sort of conference or communing with these elements in a way that I can ask and to some degree receive something in return, in the same way that I might offer something up and hopefully give back to these elements, to these concepts in a way that feeds them as well. I guess in some regards, I feed these concepts through existence. I exist in a tangible form and take up space and function within it. I am, to some degree, more or less a subject of time, although I am also, you might argue, one of many in a hive that creates the collective idea of time that arguably creates what time is to us. And so in that way, time is our subject just as much as we are its. But I keep these elements on my altar, and in, for example, calling upon elements in any spell working, I might call upon time and space. I might write any sort of chant, affirmation, anything akin to that. I might write it in terms of time and space for the sake of specificity, or to ensure that what I'm trying to manifest or trying to enact, or the will or the intention I have, is going to manifest within the confines of time and space, which is also where I exist. And taking that then into my reality, I choose to imagine that thing existing in the same sort of confines that I do, and so we're not so dissimilar, we're on the same plane, and we just kind of have to find each other, or I have to kind of reach out and grab it, but hopefully time and space can bring that thing into my equation, and that through consciously working, being very mindful and intentional of the way that I interact with time and space, I can maneuver and navigate a lot more seamlessly, without so much fuss, without a lot of resistance, if that makes sense. So I guess trying to minimize the resistance that time and space exude and exert on my life through creating more of a symbiotic relationship, if you will, which I imagine to be the case with a lot of the elements, the ways that I interact with air and my intellect. It is a symbiotic relationship. I inhale, in a very literal sense, the air. I need it to sustain myself, but I also give something back. And as human beings and as living creatures, we transmute, we take in and synthesize and then output some form. It is air, of course. Its composition is different now. It's not as high in oxygen. It's, you know what I mean? So there's that as well. We are active participants in the literal embodiments of all of these elements. And so in doing so and in imagining ourselves as that, I think we become closer to these elements, of course, by viewing the natural world, the cycles and rhythms of life. We're doing that already, but by being more conscientious about those very specific elements, we might have more, I would say, intentional control over our role in that cycle, in the interaction with that element, which is then going to bring us closer to any of our goals or desires in life at large. And of course, we might not imagine things like time and space to be traditional elements, but I like to think that so many cultures out there view elements very differently. I think it is a little bit more of a Western ideology to have, the 4 elements, or perhaps sometimes we throw in the 5th, the idea of spirit. Then we go toward other cultures, especially Eastern cultures, and sometimes the elements are categorized or thought of quite differently, and the embodiments of those elements are quite different. They are symbolized by various other things. The concept is not entirely the same, and the way that one would interact with the world based on that knowledge or belief system would, of course, be inherently different, and I find that to be abundantly fascinating. And of course, by incorporating elements that I see to be a bit unconventional but inextricable from my life, common everyday things that I have always existed alongside, I found renewed life in my practice. I've found that a lot of my intentions are more concrete, where I can then see them manifest through these topics, through these elements. And so I'd be curious to know what others do in their practice, or if time and space have roles, if you choose to personify them, or have, of course, maybe deities or higher powers that you work with that are at all connected to these concepts, along with the elements of course, fire, water, earth, air, and then, of course, there's that one spirit, which I know many of us will have some connection to or some grounding in. But I just thought I would share a little chat on that and get a conversation going. I'd love to know about maybe less conventional elements that any of you out there work with. If you work, for example, with the idea of, maybe you work with the idea of dark matter, that sort of emptiness where the actual, existence of things is quite different, although it's not exactly a vacuum. There's something there. That might be a really interesting element to toy with. That's something that's quite well out there that we've observed. Maybe you work with particles and waves, energy as a concept, something like that. I'd be very, very curious. These are all things that I enjoy experimenting with. And I do think that science and spirituality, or science and magic, are very much they're basically 2 siblings, maybe twins perhaps, of the same within the same family dynamic, and it's really about them understanding their similarities, or us understanding that they might be actually quite similar, if not the same. And I think we're starting to get to, of course, a lot of those points where we're being able to explain a lot of these things or find grounding in empirical data that can substantiate a lot of the claims that we've had about manifestation, intention, spell work, and these sorts of, I would say, outward manifestations of consciousness, and the way that consciousness can have an external, a sort of disembodied effect on the reality that we live within. The idea of something being observed and that inherently changing it always fascinates me. So let me know what you all think. If this was fun or interesting for you, feel free to like and subscribe. I hope you are all well, and until next time, bye.